One of the fastest ways to recognize mental weakness in a person is to observe how they respond to discomfort, especially the discomfort that comes from criticism, disagreement, or emotional pressure. You don't need hours of conversation to see it. Sometimes it shows itself in seconds. The moment a person feels challenged, corrected, or exposed in some small way, their nervous system reacts as if they are under threat. Their tone changes, their body tightens, their words become defensive, and instead of listening, they begin protecting themselves. This reaction is not random. It tells you something very precise about the structure of their mind. A mentally strong person can tolerate the feeling of being wrong, misunderstood, or uncomfortable, not because they enjoy it, but because their sense of self is not so fragile that it collapses under pressure. A mentally weak person, on the other hand, experiences criticism as danger. Even a small suggestion can feel like humiliation. Even a different opinion can feel like rejection. And when the mind interprets discomfort as danger, it stops thinking clearly. It goes into survival mode. When we look at this psychologically, what we are really seeing is a lack of emotional capacity. Strength is not the absence of emotion. Strength is the ability to stay present while emotion is happening. Weakness is when the emotion takes control so quickly that the person loses the ability to reflect. Instead of asking, "Is there something I can learn here?" the mind immediately asks, "How do I defend myself?" And once the mind is defending, growth stops. You will notice that people who cannot handle criticism often interrupt, justify, or attack. They may laugh it off, change the subject, or blame someone else. All of these are forms of escape. The purpose of these reactions is not truth. The purpose is relief. The mind wants to get out of the uncomfortable feeling as fast as possible. But every time a person escapes discomfort, they make themselves weaker. Because the only way the mind becomes stronger is by staying with what is difficult long enough to understand it. There is also something deeper happening here. Many people who react strongly to criticism are not reacting to the present moment at all. They are reacting to something older. Somewhere in their past, discomfort may have meant rejection, punishment, or shame. So now, even a small disagreement activates the same fear. The body remembers what the mind has forgotten. And without awareness, the person keeps repeating the same defensive pattern, believing the problem is outside of them. This is why mental strength is closely connected to self-awareness. A strong mind can notice the reaction without becoming the reaction. It can feel the discomfort and still remain curious. It can hear something unpleasant and still ask, "Is there any truth in this?" That question alone requires courage, because it means you are willing to see yourself as imperfect, and the ego does not like that. The ego wants comfort. Growth requires the opposite. So when you want to spot mental weakness quickly, don't look for how confident someone sounds when things are easy. Look at what happens when things are not easy. Watch how they respond when they are corrected, when they are challenged, when they don't get their way. In that moment, the mask drops, and the real strength of the mind becomes visible. The person who cannot sit with discomfort will always choose protection over growth, and the moment someone chooses protection over truth, you are no longer looking at strength. You are looking at fear pretending to be confidence. Another way you can recognize mental weakness very quickly is by noticing how much a person depends on validation from other people. Pay attention to how often they look around before forming an opinion, how frequently they need reassurance, how uncomfortable they become when their choices are not approved by the people around them. This constant need for validation is not just a personality trait. Psychologically, it tells you that the person's sense of self is not built from the inside. It is built from reactions, from approval, from acceptance, from applause. And when the self is built that way, it becomes extremely fragile. A mentally strong person can listen to others, can learn from others, can even change their mind when necessary, but their core does not depend on agreement. They are able to stand alone with a thought, even if nobody else supports it. A mentally weak person feels unsafe in that position. The moment they sense disapproval, their confidence begins to collapse. You can see it in their voice, in their hesitation, in the way they quickly adjust what they say so that it fits the room. This is not flexibility. This is fear of rejection. Human beings are wired for connection, so the desire to be accepted is natural. The problem begins when acceptance becomes a psychological necessity instead of a preference. When someone needs approval in order to feel okay, they lose their freedom. They stop asking what is true and start asking what will make people like me. And the moment that shift happens, the mind becomes weak because it is no longer guided by understanding. It is guided by survival. If you look closely, you will see that the need for validation often comes from a very early place. Many people learned, consciously or unconsciously, that love was conditional. They learned that being accepted meant being good, being quiet, being successful, being agreeable, being whatever the environment demanded. As a child, adapting like this can be necessary. It protects the relationship, and the relationship feels like survival. But when this pattern continues into adulthood, the person never develops a stable inner ground. They keep looking outside to find out who they are. This is why mentally weak individuals often change depending on who they are with. Around one group, they act one way. Around another group, they become someone else. They may not even realize they are doing it. The mind automatically adjusts in order to avoid the feeling of being excluded. But every time a person abandons their own perception to gain approval, they send a message to themselves: my truth is not safe. And over time, that message erodes confidence at the deepest level. A strong mind does not mean a stubborn mind. It means a grounded mind. It means you can hear disagreement without losing yourself. You can be misunderstood without feeling destroyed. You can stand alone without feeling like you are disappearing. That kind of stability does not come from ego. It comes from self-acceptance. When a person accepts themselves, approval becomes something pleasant, but not something necessary. So if you want to spot mental weakness in seconds, watch how a person behaves when approval is not guaranteed. Notice how quickly they change their words, how eagerly they look for reassurance, how uncomfortable they become when they are not praised. In that moment, you are seeing the difference between a mind that stands on its own and a mind that needs others just to remain standing. And the truth is simple but uncomfortable. The person who cannot exist without validation will always be controlled by the people they are trying to impress. Because the moment your worth depends on applause, your freedom belongs to the crowd. Another sign you can notice very quickly, sometimes within the first few minutes of conversation, is how a person deals with responsibility. Mentally weak individuals have a very predictable pattern when something goes wrong. They look outward first. The problem is the situation, the timing, other people, bad luck, the past, the system, the environment, anything except themselves. This does not mean that circumstances are never difficult or unfair. Of course they are. But the difference lies in where the mind goes first. A strong mind asks, what part of this belongs to me? A weak mind asks, who can I blame so I don't have to feel uncomfortable? Taking responsibility is psychologically demanding because it forces a person to face reality without protection. The moment you admit that your choices, your reactions, or your behavior played a role in the outcome, you lose the comfort of innocence. And the ego does not like that. The ego wants to believe that it is always right, always justified, always misunderstood rather than mistaken. So the mind creates explanations that remove personal responsibility. It tells stories where the person is always the victim, always the one who tried, always the one who was treated unfairly. If you observe carefully, you will notice how quickly this happens. You point out a mistake, and the person immediately explains why it wasn't really their fault. You question a decision, and they start listing all the reasons they had no choice. You bring attention to a pattern, and they talk about what everyone else did wrong. This reaction is not just about the situation in front of you. It reflects a deeper inability to tolerate the feeling of being responsible. Responsibility requires inner strength because it creates tension inside the mind. On one side, there is the desire to feel good about oneself. On the other side, there is the reality that we are imperfect, limited, sometimes careless, sometimes afraid. A strong person can hold both truths at the same time. They can say, I didn't mean to do harm, but I did, or the situation was difficult, but I could have handled it better. That kind of honesty stabilizes the personality because it connects the person to reality instead of to illusion. A mentally weak person cannot stay in that tension for long. The discomfort feels too threatening, so the mind escapes into blame. Blame gives immediate relief. If the problem is outside, then I don't have to change. If the fault belongs to someone else, then I can stay exactly the way I am. But the relief comes at a cost. Every time a person avoids responsibility, they give away a piece of their power. Because the moment you believe that everything happens because of others, you also believe that nothing can change unless others change first. This is why people who avoid responsibility often feel stuck in life. They repeat the same conflicts, the same frustrations, the same disappointments, and they don't understand why. From their point of view, the world keeps treating them badly. From the outside, you can see something else. You can see a mind that refuses to look at itself, and without that ability, growth becomes impossible. Strength is not shown by never making mistakes. Strength is shown by how quickly you can admit them without collapsing. When a person can say without excuses, "Yes, that was my part," you are looking at someone whose identity is strong enough to survive the truth. When a person cannot say those words, even when the evidence is obvious, you are looking at someone whose identity depends on avoiding it. So if you want to recognize mental weakness in seconds, listen carefully to how a person talks about their past, their failures, and their conflicts. In their explanations, you will hear either ownership or avoidance, either honesty or protection. And the difference between those two tells you everything. Because the moment a person refuses responsibility, they also refuse the only thing that makes change possible. Another way to recognize mental weakness almost instantly is to watch the speed of a person's reactions. Not what they say after thinking, but what happens in the first few seconds when something unexpected occurs. When plans change, when they feel offended, when someone disagrees with them, when something doesn't go their way. In those moments, the difference between reacting and responding becomes very clear. A mentally weak person reacts. A mentally strong person responds. And those two may look similar on the surface, but psychologically they come from completely different places. A reaction is automatic. It is fast, emotional, and unconscious. It happens before the person has had time to understand what they are feeling. The nervous system gets activated, the body tightens, the voice changes, and words come out without reflection. Anger, panic, defensiveness, sarcasm, shutting down. These are all forms of reaction. They are not chosen, they are triggered. When someone lives mostly in reaction, it means their inner world is not stable enough to hold strong emotion without losing control. A response, on the other hand, requires space. Even a few seconds of space is enough to change everything. In that space, the mind has the ability to notice what is happening instead of being carried away by it. The person feels the emotion, but they are not completely inside it. They can pause, breathe, think, and then decide what to say or do. This ability may look simple, but psychologically it is one of the clearest signs of mental strength. Because to respond instead of react, the mind must be able to tolerate the discomfort of the moment without escaping it. Most people who react quickly are not doing it on purpose. Their reactions were learned over time. At some point in their life, reacting fast may have been necessary. Maybe they grew up in an environment where there was no space to speak calmly, where the only way to be heard was to raise your voice, defend yourself, or shut down emotionally. The nervous system adapts to whatever environment it lives in. The problem is that the adaptation continues even when the danger is no longer there. The person still reacts as if every disagreement is a threat, as if every delay is an attack, as if every uncomfortable feeling must be removed immediately. When you observe someone who cannot pause, you are often seeing a mind that feels unsafe inside itself. Silence feels uncomfortable. Uncertainty feels unbearable. Not knowing what to say feels like weakness. So the person fills the space with words, with anger, with explanations, with anything that prevents them from sitting in that moment of tension. But that tension is exactly where strength is built. The ability to stay present when the mind wants to escape is what creates emotional stability. You will notice that people who react quickly also regret quickly. They say things they didn't mean, make decisions they later question, damage relationships without intending to. And afterward, they often say, "That's just how I am," as if the reaction defines their personality. In reality, it only shows that the mind has never learned how to slow down. And without that slowing down, there is no real choice, only impulse. A strong mind does not mean a mind without emotion. It means a mind that can feel anger without becoming destructive, feel fear without becoming paralyzed, feel hurt without needing to hurt someone back. This kind of control is not coldness. It is awareness. It is the ability to stay conscious while emotion is passing through you. So if you want to spot mental weakness in seconds, don't focus only on what people say when they are calm. Watch what happens when they are frustrated, interrupted, corrected, or challenged. In that moment, the mind reveals its true level of strength. Because the person who cannot pause will always be controlled by the moment, and the person who is controlled by the moment will never feel in control of their life. Another sign of mental weakness that becomes visible very quickly is the inability to stand alone in one's thinking. You can see it in the way some people constantly look toward the crowd before they decide what to believe, what to say, or even what to feel. Their opinions change depending on who they are with. Their confidence rises when they are supported and disappears the moment they are not. This tendency to follow the crowd is often misunderstood as being easygoing or adaptable, but psychologically it can point to something much deeper. A lack of inner grounding. To think independently requires a certain level of emotional strength. It means you are willing to tolerate the discomfort of disagreement. It means you can handle the possibility that others may not approve of you, may not understand you, may even reject you. For many people, that discomfort feels too threatening, so the mind chooses safety instead of truth. Safety is found in agreement, in belonging, in repeating what everyone else is already saying. And while this may protect the person from conflict in the short term, it slowly weakens their sense of self. Human beings are social by nature. We all want to belong somewhere. There is nothing wrong with learning from others or being influenced by the people around us. The problem begins when belonging becomes more important than honesty. When a person cannot say what they really think because they are afraid of standing alone, their mind becomes dependent on the group. Instead of asking, "Is this true?" they start asking, "Will this be accepted?" And those are very different questions. If you watch carefully, you will notice how quickly this pattern appears. In a conversation, someone expresses a strong opinion, and another person immediately agrees without thinking. In a group setting, nobody wants to be the first to disagree, even when something feels wrong. In public discussions, people repeat popular ideas without ever examining them. This is not always because they believe those ideas. Sometimes it is simply because disagreement feels unsafe. The mind prefers the comfort of belonging over the risk of being alone. From a psychological perspective, this fear of standing alone often has roots in early experience. At some point, the person may have learned that being different led to rejection, criticism, or isolation. For a child, that kind of experience can feel overwhelming, so the mind adapts. It learns to fit in, to stay quiet, to follow what others expect. This adaptation can be useful in the moment, but if it continues into adulthood, the person never fully develops their own voice. They become skilled at reading the room, but not at understanding themselves. A mentally strong person is not someone who always disagrees or tries to be different. Strength is not rebellion for its own sake. Strength is the ability to remain connected to your own perception, even when it is not popular. It means you can listen to others without losing yourself. You can belong without pretending. You can stand with the group when it makes sense, and stand alone when it doesn't. When someone lacks that ability, their identity becomes unstable. They feel confident only when the crowd supports them, and lost when it doesn't. Their direction in life is shaped more by external pressure than by internal clarity. And over time, this creates a quiet kind of anxiety, because deep down they know they are not really living from their own center. So if you want to recognize mental weakness in seconds, pay attention to how a person behaves when their opinion is different from the people around them. Notice whether they can stay with their own thought, or whether they rush to adjust it so they don't stand out. In that small moment, you can see how strong their inner foundation really is. Because the person who cannot stand alone in their thinking will always depend on the crowd for direction. And the moment your direction comes from the crowd, your life no longer belongs to you. The last sign is one that many people overlook, yet it may be one of the clearest indicators of mental strength or mental weakness, and that is a person's ability to be alone with themselves. Not physically alone for a few minutes, but psychologically alone, without distraction, without noise, without needing constant stimulation. Watch how uncomfortable some people become the moment there is silence. The phone comes out immediately, the television turns on, music starts playing, a conversation begins, anything to avoid being left alone with their own thoughts. This is not just habit. Very often it is avoidance. A mentally strong person has the capacity to sit with themselves without feeling the need to escape. That does not mean they always enjoy it. Silence can bring up uncomfortable thoughts, old memories, doubts, regrets, questions about life that do not have easy answers. But strength shows itself in the ability to remain present even when the mind becomes restless. Weakness shows itself in the urgent need to run away from that restlessness as quickly as possible. When a person cannot tolerate being alone with their own mind, it usually means there is something inside that feels unsafe to face. The human mind is very intelligent when it comes to protection. If certain thoughts bring shame, guilt, fear, or a sense of emptiness, the mind learns to stay busy. It fills every moment with activity, with entertainment, with conversation, with work, with anything that keeps attention on the outside. On the surface, this can look like productivity or sociability, but underneath there is often a quiet fear of what might appear if everything became still. From a psychological point of view, the ability to be alone is closely connected to the ability to know yourself. If you never sit with your own thoughts, you never really see the patterns that drive your behavior. You don't notice your fears, your insecurities, your contradictions. You just keep moving from one distraction to another, and life passes without much awareness. A strong mind is not one that has no darkness inside. It is one that is willing to look at that darkness without collapsing. You can often recognize this difference very quickly. Some people cannot stay in silence for more than a few seconds without feeling the need to fill the space. In conversation, they talk constantly, not always because they have something important to say, but because quiet feels uncomfortable. When they are alone, they reach for their phone without thinking. When life slows down, they become anxious. The stillness itself feels threatening, even when nothing is actually wrong. A mentally strong person relates to silence differently. They can pause before speaking. They can sit without needing to be entertained. They can reflect without immediately distracting themselves. This does not make them distant or cold. In fact, it often makes them more present because they are not afraid of what they might feel. When you are not afraid of your own mind, you do not need to run from it. There is also a deeper philosophical side to this. The relationship you have with yourself sets the foundation for every other relationship in your life. If you cannot be alone with yourself, you will depend on others to escape yourself. You will seek constant company, constant approval, constant noise, not because you truly need it, but because without it you feel lost. And when a person feels lost inside, they will look outside for something to hold on to, even if that something is not healthy for them. So if you want to spot mental weakness in seconds, notice how a person reacts to stillness. Notice whether they can stay present without reaching for distraction, whether they can sit in silence without becoming uneasy, whether they can face their own thoughts without immediately turning away. In that quiet moment, more truth appears than in hours of conversation. Because the person who cannot be alone with themselves will spend their whole life running, and no matter how fast they go, they will never escape the one person they cannot leave behind.